She had 400 employees, 3 private jets, and a $1 billion company at 30 years old, and she couldn't get her own 8-year-old daughter to look her in the eyes. Vivian Sterling had tried everything, the best specialists money could find, therapists flown in from overseas, treatments that cost more per session than most people earned in a month. And still, Lena sat in her room, drawing in silence, locked inside a world that no one could enter. Then a maintenance worker walked through the wrong door at the wrong hour, and everything changed. If this story already has your attention, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Because what happens between a burned-out billionaire mother, a quiet man with a classified past, and one little girl who stopped speaking is going to stay with you long after it's over. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night it started, Vivian Sterling was not supposed to be in the building. She had a car waiting downstairs, a dinner she was already 40 minutes late to, and a board presentation the next morning that she hadn't finished reviewing. Her assistant had texted 3 times. The restaurant had called once, and still she sat at her desk on the 34th floor of Sterling Tech headquarters, staring at a report she wasn't reading, with a glass of water she hadn't touched, thinking about a drawing her daughter had made that morning. It was a picture of a house. Not their house. Their house had 6 bedrooms, a glass staircase, and a view of the city that architects put in magazines. This house in Lena's drawing was small, square. 1 door, 2 windows, 4 stick figures standing outside it. Vivian had studied the drawing for a long time before she left for work, trying to understand what Lena was trying to say. She never knew anymore. She used to think she did. She used to believe that a mother always understood her own child on some instinctive level that didn't require words. She had stopped believing that about 14 months ago. She set down her pen and rubbed her eyes. The floor was quiet. Most of the team had gone home hours ago. The overhead lights had dimmed to their automatic evening setting, leaving only the glow of her monitors and the soft amber of the city outside the window. 40 stories of glass and steel, and right now it felt like the loneliest place she had ever sat. Her phone buzzed again. She turned it face down. Lena had been diagnosed with autism at age 5. In the time since, Vivian had read every study she could find, hired every specialist her money could reach, and restructured her entire schedule around her daughter's routines. She'd done everything the right way, everything the professionals told her to do, and she had watched Lena slowly withdraw anyway. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet way that grief moved, gradually, and then all at one moment. Until one day Vivian realized that the little girl who used to fall asleep holding her hand now flinched sometimes when she reached for her. That was the thing none of the specialists said in their brochures. They talked about strategies and progress charts and sensory integration and therapeutic frameworks. They didn't talk about what it felt like to be the mother standing on the other side of the glass, watching every approach fail in slow motion. The last specialist, a woman with impressive credentials and a soft, practiced voice, had sat across from Vivian in her office 3 weeks ago and said, "Progress with children like Lena takes time. There are no guarantees, but we are moving in a positive direction." Vivian had thanked her and driven home and sat in her car in the garage for 22 minutes before going inside. She was thinking about that when she heard the sound in the hallway. It was subtle, a cartwheel on polished floor, the soft knock of a door being opened with professional carefulness. She almost ignored it. Maintenance came through after hours all the time. But something made her look up. The man who appeared in the doorway of this conference room across from her office was carrying a mop. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the quiet way of someone who didn't think about it, wearing the gray uniform of the building's contracted cleaning crew. He glanced into her office, saw her sitting there, and gave a short nod. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I can come back." "It's fine," she said, looking back at her screen. "Do what you need to do." He nodded again and moved past the doorway. She heard the sound of the cart continuing down the hall. She went back to not reading her report. That was the first time she saw Cole Bennett. She didn't see him again for 11 days. In that time, she sat through 2 board meetings, gave a keynote at a tech conference in San Francisco, fired a vice president who had been quietly redirecting department funds, and took Lena to 3 separate appointments: an occupational therapist on Tuesday, a speech pathologist on Thursday, and a behavioral specialist on Saturday who spent 45 minutes trying to get Lena to make eye contact using a reward system involving small colored tokens. Lena had sat at the table, looked at the wall, and said nothing. On the drive home, Vivian had watched her daughter in the rearview mirror. Lena sat with her knees pulled up and her sketchbook open in her lap, drawing something with a dark pencil. Her face was calm, not unhappy, just somewhere else entirely. Vivian had opened her mouth twice to say something and closed it both times. What was there to say that she hadn't already said? The second time she ran into Cole was not at the office. It was a Saturday afternoon at Mercer Park, 3 blocks from Vivian's home. She had brought Lena there because the speech pathologist had recommended outdoor unstructured time, and Vivian had run out of structured things that worked. Lena liked the park well enough. She didn't play on the equipment. She found a bench near the edge of the walking path and sat there with her sketchbook, and that was fine. Vivian sat beside her and watched the other children and tried not to do the thing where she compared. She noticed Cole because he was the only adult at the park who wasn't on his phone. He was sitting on the grass about 30 feet away, his back against a tree, watching a girl, maybe 7 or 8, who was climbing on the rope structure with aggressive determination. The girl had her hair in 2 lopsided braids and she was talking constantly, narrating everything she did to no one in particular. And Cole was watching her with this expression that Vivian found hard to describe. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride, something that looked like relief. The girl slipped on one of the rope rungs and caught herself, and Cole's whole body moved forward half an inch and then stopped. The girl caught herself, pulled herself back up, and laughed. Cole settled back against the tree. He noticed Vivian looking at him. He seemed to recognize her at the same moment she recognized him, the maintenance man from the 34th floor. He gave the same short nod. She nodded back. And then Lena, who had been drawing for 20 minutes without acknowledging the world around her, looked up from her sketchbook and stared directly at Cole. Vivian felt it before she understood it. Something shifted in her daughter's posture. Not fear, not the anxious stiffening that happened when strangers got too close or when sounds became too much. Something else. Lena tilted her head and watched Cole with the focused intensity she usually reserved for things she was trying to memorize. The pattern on a ceiling, the structure of a leaf, the way shadows moved. Cole glanced at Lena. He didn't smile at her in the performative way adults sometimes did with children they felt required acknowledgement. He just looked at her for a moment, calm and unhurried, the way you'd look at someone sitting on a park bench. And then he looked away, and Lena went back to her drawing. But her posture had changed. Her shoulders had come down somewhere during those 10 seconds. She was sitting differently, less coiled. Vivian watched this happen and didn't say anything because she didn't want to break whatever it was. She didn't bring Lena back to the office often. The building was too loud, too unpredictable, and the fluorescent lighting in some of the hallways made Lena press her hands over her ears. But 3 weeks after the park, Vivian had an emergency situation. Her nanny had called out sick on the same morning as a crisis meeting she couldn't reschedule. And by the time she'd worked through every backup option, it was 7:30 and the meeting was at 9, and she had 45 minutes to get them both ready and downtown. She set Lena up in the small conference room adjacent to her office. It had soft lighting, a round table instead of a rectangular one, a window that looked out on the skyline. She put Lena's backpack on the table, sketchbook, colored pencils, the small felt animals she sometimes arranged in patterns, and told her assistant, Dara, to check in every 15 minutes. "I'll be right through that wall," Vivian told Lena. Lena was already drawing. The meeting ran long. 40 minutes turned into 2 hours. By the time Vivian walked out, her jaw ached from the tension she'd been holding in it, and she moved down the hall toward the conference room, braced for the sound of distress that sometimes came when Lena's environment shifted unexpectedly. She stopped in the hallway. Through the glass panel beside the conference room door, she could see Cole. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the window, not at the table, on the floor, and he had his back turned to Lena at an angle that didn't feel deliberate but probably was. He was doing something with his hands, folding something. Paper. He was folding a piece of paper. Lena was watching him from her chair. She still had her pencil in her hand, but she wasn't drawing. Cole finished whatever he was folding and set it on the floor beside him without turning around. A paper crane. Small, slightly imperfect, one wing a little longer than the other. Vivian watched her daughter look at the crane. then look at the back of Cole's head. Then, slowly, Lena climbed down from her chair, walked the 4 feet to where Cole was sitting, and picked up the crane. She held it in both hands and studied it closely. Cole still didn't turn around. He started folding another piece of paper. After a minute, Lena sat down on the floor. Not next to him, a few feet away, in the careful way she needed space, and watched him work. Vivian stood in the hallway and felt something open up in her chest that she didn't have a name for. She turned to Dara, who had appeared beside her. "How long has he been in there?" "About 40 minutes, Dara said quietly. "He came to clean the room, and I told him it was occupied. He said, okay. Then she apparently came and stood in the doorway and looked at him, and he just sat down on the floor. I hope that was all right. I didn't know whether to—" "It's fine," Vivian said. She didn't go in. She pulled his employment file that evening. Cole Bennett, 37, contracted through Apex Building Services. Prior to Apex, which he'd joined 14 months ago, there was a gap. Not a small one. Nearly 2 years of nothing, then a few lines about previous employment at a warehouse logistics company that had apparently gone under. Before that, the file got thin in the way files got thin when someone didn't want to be found. She had Marcus, her head of corporate security, make a few quiet calls the next day. Marcus came back 24 hours later with a look on his face she recognized. The look of someone who had found something he hadn't expected to find. "His background is complicated," Marcus said, choosing his words. "Complicated how?" Marcus set a folder on her desk. Not thick, just a few pages. "He was Navy SEAL, classified assignments, multiple tours. Decorated. He left service about 3 years ago under circumstances that are, the official version is medical discharge. Some of the operational details are restricted. He's not flagged anywhere as a threat. He's clean. He just—" Marcus paused. "He's not who he looks like on paper. He's considerably more than that." Vivian looked at the folder for a long time. "He has a daughter," she said. "Yes. Maya, 7 years old. Her mother left when Maya was 2. He's been raising her alone." She thought about the park. The way he'd leaned forward when Maya slipped and caught himself. "He's working 3 jobs," Marcus said. "Apex, and 2 others. He's not struggling financially in the sense of being in trouble, but he's working very hard to keep things stable." Vivian nodded slowly. "Thank you, Marcus." "You want me to keep looking?" "No," she said. "That's enough." She introduced herself properly the following week. Not in the building, she stopped at the park again on a Saturday afternoon, Lena in tow, and found him in the same spot by the same tree, watching Maya on the same equipment with the same expression. She walked over and sat down on the grass a few feet away with the careful awareness that she was on his territory here, not hers. "Cole Bennett," she said. He looked at her without surprise. "Ms. Sterling." "Vivian." She paused. "I looked you up." A beat of silence. He didn't look away. "How far back did you go?" "Far enough." He was quiet for a moment, watching Maya, then, "Is this a problem?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I don't know what it is. I know that my daughter sat on the floor next to you for 20 minutes 2 weeks ago, and she hasn't sat voluntarily near a stranger in over a year." Cole said nothing. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Vivian said. "I'm not offering you anything. I wanted to know who you were. And since I found out, I felt like you should know that I found out." She stopped, realizing she wasn't making a great deal of sense. "I'm not sure what I'm saying." "You're saying thank you," Cole said, without wanting to make it into something. She looked at him. "Yes, that's what I'm saying." He nodded slowly. Maya called out from the top of the rope structure. "Dad, look, I made it to the top." And Cole looked up and raised one hand, and the girl beamed like she'd climbed a mountain. Vivian looked over at Lena on her bench. Her daughter was looking at Maya with something in her expression that Vivian rarely saw there. Not quite longing, something more complex, something that looked like recognition. "She watches Maya a lot," Cole said. "I know. Maya talks enough for 6 kids." He didn't say it critically. There was warmth underneath it. "But she doesn't push. She just goes on with whatever she's doing. Lena seems okay with that." A lot of people don't know how to be around her without trying to engage her, Vivian said. Even people who care about her, they feel like they need to pull her out. She's not hiding, Cole said. She's just in a different place. You can visit someone without dragging them somewhere they didn't ask to go. Vivian turned to look at him. He was still watching his daughter, like he'd said something casual, something not worth dwelling on. Where did you learn that? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Took me a while to figure out that most situations resolve better if you stop forcing them. She didn't push. He didn't offer more. They sat there while the afternoon moved around them, and after a while Lena got up from her bench and walked to the edge of the grass and sat down 15 feet from Cole with her sketchbook open, and drew in silence, and didn't seem to need anything from anyone. And for the first time in longer than Vivian could remember, she sat still and let that be enough. The drawing started changing in October. Vivian noticed it first on a Thursday morning when she went into Lena's room to check on her before the school transport arrived. Lena was already awake. She was almost always awake before Vivian, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her sketchbook balanced on her knees, working with the focused intensity of someone who had somewhere to be inside her own head. The sketchbook was private in a way that Vivian had learned to respect. She didn't ask to look unless Lena offered, and Lena rarely offered. But that morning, the book had slipped sideways on the blanket when Lena reached for a different pencil, and Vivian caught a glimpse of the open page before she could look away out of habit. It was a drawing of a man sitting cross-legged on a floor. Broad shoulders, head bent slightly forward, hands busy with something in his lap. The posture was unmistakable. Vivian stood in the doorway and didn't say a word about it. She thought about it the whole drive to work. It had been 6 weeks since the afternoon at the park, where she'd sat on the grass with Cole while their daughters existed in the same space without requiring anything from each other. In the time since, they'd been to the park 3 more times. Nothing had been arranged. It wasn't as formal as that. Vivian had simply found herself going on Saturday afternoons, and Cole was there, and at some point it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a pattern that neither of them acknowledged out loud. The dynamic was always the same. Cole sat near his tree. Maya talked constantly, loudly, cheerfully, narrating her own life as she lived it. Lena sat on her bench or sometimes on the grass nearby, close enough to be in the orbit of all that noise without being required to participate in it. And gradually, incrementally, the distance between Lena's chosen spot and where Cole sat had been getting smaller. Vivian had been measuring it the way she measured everything connected to her daughter, carefully, quietly, without letting herself read too much into any single data point, because hope in those conditions was a dangerous thing. She'd had hope before. She'd watched it not work out. But the drawings were new. She called Dr. Patricia Huang that afternoon. Patricia was Lena's developmental pediatrician, the one professional in the long list of professionals who spoke to Vivian like a person rather than a liability concern. She'd been with them for 3 years. The drawings might mean something, Patricia said, or they might not. What I'd be more interested in is Lena's affect when she's in this man's presence. What does her body language do? She settles, Vivian said, and was surprised by how hard it was to say simply. She just settles, like something stops running in her that's always running. That's not nothing, Patricia said. That's actually quite significant. He doesn't try to connect with her. He's near her, and she seems to decide what to do with that. A pause on the line. You know what that sounds like? It sounds like he's not treating her like a problem to be solved. Vivian was quiet. Most people who interact with Lena, Patricia continued, even the ones who love her, approach her with an agenda. Engage. Respond. Demonstrate progress. Kids like Lena feel that. They feel it the way you'd feel someone standing too close. It's pressure, even when it's well-intentioned. If this man is genuinely indifferent to getting something from her, she may simply find that restful. Restful, Vivian repeated. Is there a reason you're concerned about it? I'm concerned about everything, Vivian said. That's the job. Patricia made the small sound she made when she agreed, but wasn't going to say so directly. Let it run, she said. Watch it. Don't engineer it. Vivian thanked her, hung up, and sat at her desk for a while with the particular helplessness of someone who was professionally excellent at engineering things. The morning she found out about his daughter was a Tuesday in early November, cold enough that the park had started to feel more like commitment than leisure. Maya had insisted on the rope structure despite the temperature, wearing a jacket that was too thin for the weather and not carrying even slightly. Cole had made her put on a hat, a negotiation that took 4 minutes and ended in a hat worn sideways, and then settled back against the tree and let her get on with it. Lena was on the grass, closer to Cole than she'd ever been, working in her sketchbook. She'd been positioned about 6 feet away from him for nearly 20 minutes without adjusting her distance. For anyone else, 6 feet would be nothing. For Lena, 6 feet was an open door. Vivian was watching all of this when Maya came off the equipment and ran over to Cole at full speed, dropped into the grass beside him without ceremony, and announced, "I'm going to be a marine biologist when I grow up, or maybe a truck driver, one of those." "Good range," Cole said. "What were you when you grew up?" "I'm still working on it." Maya absorbed this with the thoroughness of a 7-year-old who wasn't sure if she was being teased. "Lena," she said, turning, "what do you want to be?" Lena didn't look up from her sketchbook. Maya waited approximately 2 seconds, a notable patience for her, and then turned back to her father. "She's busy." "She is," Cole agreed. "That's okay. I'm busy too sometimes." Maya lay back in the grass and looked at the sky. "My teacher says I should work on my listening skills." "Your teacher is right." "I know, but it's hard. My brain goes really fast." "I know, Bug." Vivian watched this exchange and felt the ordinary tenderness of it settle somewhere behind her sternum. The way Cole talked to his daughter, not down to her, not around her, just straight at her like she was a complete person who happened to be 7, it was the same way he didn't talk to Lena, which was exactly the thing that worked. She hadn't meant to say what she said next. "Her mother," she started, and then stopped. Cole looked at her. He waited. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's not my business." "She left," he said. Not like it was painful, or not only painful, like it was a fact he'd had enough time to stop being surprised by. Maya was 2. We'd been married 4 years before that. It wasn't working for a long time before she left. The deployments, the not knowing when or whether I was coming home, the version of me that showed up between them. He paused. I wasn't easy to live with, I'll say that much. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "I'm not explaining myself. You asked." She looked at him. "I didn't actually ask." "You started to." A pause. "I've noticed you do that. Start asking things and then stop because you think it's impolite." Vivian felt a flicker of something, surprise, and then the mild irritation of being accurately read. "I was raised to think direct questions were rude." "They're not. They're efficient." "Is that a military philosophy?" "It's a time philosophy. You waste less of it." He looked at Maya, who was now doing something elaborate with a stick and a pile of leaves. "What do you actually want to know?" She considered the question honestly. "I want to know why you're here," she said. "Not at the park. Here. In this city, working maintenance jobs. Someone like you." "Someone like me?" he repeated, not quite a question. "I know some of what you did," she said carefully, "not the details. Just enough to know that this isn't what you were built for." Cole was quiet for a moment. The stick situation with Maya had escalated and he tracked it without moving, the way he tracked everything. Peripheral, constant, automatic. "After I got out," he said, "I had about 6 months where I was sure I was going to figure out what came next. Something in private security, probably. That's where a lot of guys end up." He stopped. "Then I had a bad stretch. And then I had Maya. And the bad stretch got worse for a while. And then it got better. And by the time I was on the other side of it, I just didn't want what I used to think I wanted." "What did you want?" "To pick my kid up from school every day," he said, like it was the most straightforward thing in the world. That was it. That was the whole list. Vivian looked at her hands. Her own list had never been that short, and she wasn't sure whether that said something about ambition or something else entirely. "That's not an insult to you," Cole said, reading her expression again, which was starting to become a pattern she found mildly unnerving. "Different people want different things. Nothing wrong with wanting to build something. Unless you build it at the expense of the people next to you," she said quietly. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Things shifted inside the building around the same time. Vivian hadn't arranged it. That was the truth. She had extended Cole's cleaning assignment to include the executive floor. Not because she had a plan, but because the current provider was unreliable and Marcus had suggested consolidating contracts, and it was simply the practical decision. If she spent slightly more time at her desk on evenings when she knew his schedule, that was her own business, and she didn't examine it too closely. What she didn't anticipate was Lena. She'd brought her daughter in twice more since the conference room incident. Lena liked certain parts of the building, the server room's low electronic hum, which seemed to calibrate something in her nervous system, and the east-facing windows at dusk, when the city lit up in stages. Vivian had started keeping a bag of Lena's things in her office for the occasions when the backup plan fell through again, and it did fall through, because life with a 7-year-old in an unstructured job didn't tend toward predictability. The second time Cole was in the building when Lena was there, Vivian was in a call that she couldn't interrupt. Dara had Lena in the conference room again, and Vivian was watching through the interior window between her office and the conference room. Not subtle, but she'd stopped pretending to herself. When Cole came through with his cart, saw Lena through the glass, and stopped. He didn't go in. He parked his cart against the wall, sat down on the floor of the hallway outside the open door, not inside, outside, and started folding paper again from a small square pad he apparently kept in his jacket pocket. Vivian realized after a moment that he'd done this before, this exact thing, and she wondered when he'd started carrying paper. Lena didn't acknowledge him for about 10 minutes. Then she looked up, looked at the doorway, looked back at her sketchbook. Then she looked at the doorway again. She got down from her chair and walked to the door and stood there. She looked at Cole on the floor of the hallway. He was folding without looking up, steady and unhurried, and the paper thing taking shape in his hands was going to be something. A dog, maybe. She couldn't tell yet. Lena sat down in the doorway, right in the threshold. She pulled her sketchbook into her lap and opened it and started drawing. Cole kept folding. Neither of them spoke. Dara appeared at Vivian's shoulder, looked through the window, and said in a low voice, Do you want me to do anything?" "No," Vivian said. "Just leave it." They sat that way, Lena in the doorway, Cole in the hall, for the better part of 40 minutes. When Vivian finally ended her call and walked out, Cole was finishing up his section of the floor, and Lena was back at the table with 3 paper animals lined up beside her sketchbook. A crane, a dog, and something that might have been a rabbit, or might have been a bear. It was hard to say. Lena was drawing all 3 of them. Vivian picked up the bear rabbit and turned it in her hands. "She hasn't let anyone new give her things in a long time," she said. "I didn't give them to her," Cole said, collecting his supplies. "I just made them in the hallway." She looked at him. "There's a difference," he said simply. She thought about that for the rest of the evening. He had a way of saying things like that. Observations that weren't advice, conclusions that weren't lectures, that took up more space in her head than she expected. She was not someone who was easily impressed. She'd been around genuinely brilliant people, engineers who'd built things that changed entire industries, researchers who were rewriting what their fields understood, investors who'd made generational bets that paid off. She knew what impressive looked like. This was different. Cole wasn't impressive in any of the ways she was used to measuring. He was just precise. In a very particular way. Like someone who had learned, through conditions she could only imagine, to see past the surface of things and deal only with what was actually there. He didn't perform patience with Lena. He had it. She started noticing everything he didn't do. He never crouched down to Lena's level in the exaggerated way adults did when they wanted children to know they were being taken seriously. He never used the slightly elevated, slightly artificial warmth that most people put on like a jacket when they were around a child who needed careful handling. He never redirected the conversation when Lena was in the room, didn't start speaking in code with Vivian, didn't lower his voice, didn't treat her daughter's presence as something to be managed. He just went on being the same person he was when Lena wasn't there. And Lena seemed to understand that she wasn't being accommodated, which meant she wasn't being pitied, which meant she didn't have to brace against it. "How did you figure that out?" Vivian asked him one Saturday at the park. The temperature had dropped properly now, and they were both sitting on the bench. Lena had claimed the spot under the tree, which was Cole's usual spot, and neither of them had said anything about it. With her, "How did you know what to do?" "I didn't know anything," he said. In my experience, when you stop trying to get something from someone, they stop defending against you." "That's not a parenting philosophy." "No, he agreed. I learned it in worse situations than this one. She let that sit without pushing it. She was learning how he worked, the things he'd say if you didn't press, and the things that were behind doors he hadn't decided to open yet. I had a guy in my unit, Cole said, after a minute. I was looking at Lena under the tree. Quietest person I ever worked with. Never spoke unless he had something to say. Most people wrote him off the first 5 minutes because they thought he was checked out, thought he was distant. A pause. I was the best reader of a room I ever saw. He saw everything. He just didn't feel the need to announce it. And Lena reminds you of him. Cole was quiet for a second. Not exactly, but I understand people who don't perform themselves for other people's comfort. I spent enough time around them to know that what you see on the surface is usually the least interesting part. Vivian looked across the grass at her daughter, who had opened her sketchbook and was drawing something with the charcoal pencil she'd been obsessed with that week. She used to talk more, she said. When she was 4, 5. She had words, and then she stopped. You don't have to. No, I know. People assume she was always this way. She wasn't. There was a version of her that talked more, and then it just went somewhere. The specialists have different theories. I stopped needing to know which theory was right about a year ago. What do you need to know instead? She thought about it. How to be in the room with her without it costing her something. Cole nodded slowly, like the question was a serious one that deserved to be treated as such. You're better at it than you think, he said. How would you know that? Because she still lets you in the room. Vivian said nothing for a moment. The wind came through and moved the dry leaves along the path. Lena looked up at the sound of it and then back at her sketchbook. That's either a very kind thing to say, Vivian said, or a very low bar. It's both, Cole said. And she heard the very small edge of something in his voice that was almost humor, and she found that she was nearly smiling at the cold air. The problem started in late November. She should have seen them coming. She'd been around enough boardrooms and enough people with too much money and too much investment in what her private life looked like to think she was invisible. She was not invisible. She was one of the most followed CEOs in her industry, and people made it their business to notice the things that happened around her. The first indication was a comment from Gareth Wiley, her CFO, on a Wednesday morning. They were walking out of a budget review, or rather she was walking and he was keeping up, which was how most of their conversations happened. And he said, without particular inflection, I heard you've been spending time with one of the contract cleaning staff. Vivian kept walking. I've been spending time at the park with my daughter. Right. A pause. People notice things. People don't have anything better to do is the problem. Vivian. He said her name the way he said it when he was about to be diplomatic and didn't want to be. You know I don't care about your personal choices, but there are investors who… Gareth. Yes? I know what you're about to say, and I'm telling you it's none of your business or theirs. He was quiet for a moment. He's a maintenance contractor. I'm aware of what he does. And that doesn't… Gareth. She stopped walking and turned to face him. He was a good CFO. She liked him, mostly. He was also someone who had very fixed ideas about the way things were supposed to look, and she had never fully decided if that was a flaw or just a fact. I have a daughter who has not responded to another adult outside our immediate family in almost 2 years, and she responds to this person. That's the whole story. If you want to make it into something else, that's your issue, not mine. Gareth looked at her for a moment. Fair enough, he said, and dropped it. But he wasn't the only one. Diane Park, her VP of Communications, brought it up a week later in a different way, framed as concern about public perception, about what a profile piece might look like if someone got hold of the wrong angle. Vivian listened, thanked her, and told her the same thing she'd told Gareth. 2 board members brought it up in the same week, phrased differently by each, and meaning the same thing by both. The message was clear. People had decided what this was, and what it was, in their reading, was a billionaire making a questionable personal decision that would, sooner or later, become a story. She didn't tell Cole about any of it. She wasn't sure why, except that it felt like bringing the loudest and most unpleasant parts of her world into the quiet that he existed in, and she wasn't ready to do that. But he noticed something had changed. He noticed the way he noticed everything, which was without announcement. You've got something on your mind, he said. Another Saturday, another park, Mid-December now, and properly cold, their breath visible, Lena in her red coat under the tree. Maya was in the pavilion shelter across the path, conducting an elaborate game that appeared to involve being a dragon. "I always have something on my mind," Vivian said, "more than usual." She looked at him. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "No." He shrugged. "People telegraph. Most of the time people tell you exactly what's going on if you watch instead of talking." He paused. "What happened?" She thought about lying, said, not out of deception, but out of a habit of protecting herself by not needing people to know things. Then she thought about what he'd said once about direct questions being efficient. "Some of the people around me have opinions about the time I spend here," she said. "With you." Cole absorbed this without any visible reaction. "What kind of opinions?" "The kind that assume the simplest possible explanation." He was quiet for a moment. "And what's the simplest possible explanation?" "That you want something, access, money, attention." She said it without apology because softening it would have been condescending. "The usual reasons someone from your position would spend time with someone from mine." Cole nodded slowly. "And you don't think that?" "I don't think that." "Why not?" She looked at him. "Because if that were what this was, you'd have done something by now. You're not a passive person. If you had an agenda, we'd know." He didn't smile. He just looked out across the park. "It's not nothing, people thinking that. It can cause problems for you." "I'm aware." "I'm not saying I'll stop coming to the park," he said. "I'm just saying, Cole." She stopped him. "I am the problem people in my life have been trying to manage for about 20 years. I'm not going to stop doing something because someone has an uncomfortable opinion about it." A beat of silence. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Across the path, Maya had recruited 2 other children into her dragon game and was assigning them roles with the authority of someone who had been running operations her entire life. Lena had looked up from her sketchbook and was watching Maya with that expression again, the complex, concentrated one that wasn't quite longing, that Vivian had been trying to read for months. And then Lena did something she hadn't done in longer than Vivian could calculate. She picked up her sketchbook, stood up, and walked, not quickly, not with any kind of announcement, across the path toward the pavilion. She stopped about 10 feet from where Maya was organizing her dragon recruits. She didn't join. She just stood there with her sketchbook against her chest and watched. Maya saw her. "You can be a dragon too," she said, as if this were obvious and the invitation had been standing the entire time. "Or you can be the narrator. The narrator explains what's happening." Lena stood there. "The narrator doesn't have to talk if they don't want," Maya added, adjusting the rules with cheerful flexibility. "They can just watch and know." Lena looked at her sketchbook. She sat down on the pavilion bench at the edge of the game's territory, opened to a new page, and began to draw. Maya accepted this completely and returned to her dragons. Vivian sat very still on her bench across the path, watching her daughter sit on the edge of another child's world, and not be asked to change, and felt something move through her that she wasn't prepared for. Not joy exactly, not relief exactly, something older and quieter than either of those. Something that felt like the specific ache of watching a door open that you'd stopped believing would open. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at Cole. But after a moment, she felt him shift slightly on the bench beside her, and she understood that he was watching the same thing and that he also wasn't going to ruin it by talking about it. They sat there in the cold while their daughters existed in each other's orbit, and the city went on around them, indifferent and loud. And for that hour, nothing was fixed and nothing was solved. And it was still, despite everything, the best afternoon Vivian Sterling had spent in longer than she cared to admit. January came in hard and cold, and with it came the kind of institutional pressure that Vivian had learned to recognize by its particular smell. The slightly overheated air of conference rooms where people said reasonable-sounding things that meant unreasonable things. The Sterling Tech Annual Stakeholder Summit was scheduled for the 3rd week of February. It was not a small event. 400 attendees across 2 days, investors, board members, institutional partners, journalists from 3 financial publications, and a live-streamed segment that typically reached another 40,000 viewers in the industry. Vivian had been running it for 6 years. She knew its rhythms the way she knew her own building, where the pressure points were, which hallway conversations mattered more than the panel discussions, which smiling faces concealed which anxieties. This year there was a new anxiety, and it had a specific shape. Her board had spent the better part of December managing a situation she hadn't been fully briefed on until the second week of January, a situation that had been described to her in the careful language of legal counsel and corporate communications professionals as a hostile positioning by a competing interest group. What it actually was, stripped of the careful language, was this: a consortium of 3 institutional investors, led by a man named Richard Callaway, who ran a private equity operation out of Dallas, and who had made a considerable fortune buying distressed technology companies and reorganizing them into profitability, had been quietly accumulating Sterling Tech shares for 8 months. They now held 11%. The threshold for demanding a board seat was 10. Callaway's people had made contact the previous week. They had, in the language of the memo Vivian read twice and then set face down on her desk, expressed interest in discussing the company's long-term strategic direction. "Which means they want to move me," Vivian said to her general counsel, a meticulous woman named Fiona Marsh, who had been with Sterling Tech since year 2 and who operated on approximately 4 hours of sleep and unlimited black coffee. "It means they want leverage," Fiona said. "A board seat gets them leverage. What they do with it depends on how the next 6 months go." "And the summit?" "The summit is important. If Callaway's people show up and they've confirmed they'll be there, this is the first public forum where the company's narrative either holds or it doesn't. Every investor in that room will be reading the temperature." Vivian understood all of this. She'd been reading corporate temperatures her entire professional life. What she was less prepared for was how this particular situation intersected with the other parts of her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first intersection came from Diane Park, who called her on a Tuesday morning and said, in the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed, "I need to talk to you about the summit's public profile, specifically around potential personal narrative angles that journalists might pursue." Vivian waited. "There's been some pickup in the business press," Diane said. "Nothing major yet. A column item in one of the finance blogs. But Callaway's team has people who are good at finding angles. And say what you're saying, Diane." A breath. "Your friendship with the Bennett man. It's going to come up. Callaway's people will use anything that makes you look impulsive or, my daughter's well-being is not a corporate communications issue. I know that, but the framing of it can become one. A billionaire CEO who is, quote, spending significant time with a contract worker whose daughter has special needs right before a major governance challenge." Diane paused. "I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying it's a narrative that could be shaped in an unfavorable direction by people who have an interest in doing that." Vivian sat with this for a moment. The part of her that had built a billion-dollar company understood exactly what Diane was telling her, why it mattered, and how to think about it strategically. That part of her was functional and clear-eyed and completely unemotional about it. The other part of her thought about Lena sitting on the pavilion bench at the edge of Maya's dragon game, drawing, belonging to the edges of something without being asked to be more than she was. "Set up additional media prep for the summit," she said. "Brief the board on Callaway's confirmed attendance. And Diane, the personal situation is not changing. Find another angle." Diane said she would, in the tone of someone who wished she were someone else's problem. Vivian hung up and stood at her office window for a while, watching the city below do its ordinary winter business, and tried to locate the exact place where her professional life and the rest of her life were supposed to separate. She'd been trying to locate that place for 6 years. She still hadn't found it. She told Cole about Callaway the following Saturday. She hadn't planned to. It came out in the middle of a conversation that had started somewhere else entirely. They'd been talking about Maya's school situation, a teacher conflict that Cole was navigating with the grinding patience of someone who had learned that institutions moved at their own pace, and fighting them directly cost more than it won. And then Vivian had said, without fully deciding to, "I have a situation at work that has complicated things." She told him the outline. Not all the details. The specific financial mechanics weren't relevant, but enough. Callaway, the shares, the summit, the way it was intersecting with the comments people had been making about the time she spent at the park. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How serious is it?" "Serious enough that I'm paying attention to it." "What does he actually want, the Callaway guy?" "Control, or the appearance of it. Some restructuring that would increase short-term returns at the cost of longer projects we've been building for 3 years." She paused. And he wants a story, a reason. These things always need a story, a reason why the current leadership is the problem and the alternative is the answer. And you're the story. I might be part of it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Maya was in the pavilion shelter again, this time drawing her own pictures at the table. She'd taken an interest in Lena's sketchbooks and had begun carrying a notebook of her own, which Vivian found privately moving in a way she didn't examine. Lena was beside her, not close enough to touch, but beside her. They'd been there for 40 minutes, both drawing, not talking, with the particular piece of two people who had worked out between themselves what being together required. "You're worried about me being a problem for you," Cole said. "I'm worried about powerful people using the things I care about as leverage," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her. "I'm not distancing myself," she said clearly. "I'm telling you there are people who will try to make this into something it's not, and you should know that before they do it publicly, and you're surprised by it." Cole nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." "I also want to know something," she said, "and I'm asking directly, since you pointed out I have a habit of not doing that." "Go ahead." "Is there anything in your past that they could find, anything that someone would look at and use?" It was not a comfortable question. She knew that. She asked it anyway, because not asking would have been worse, would have been the kind of strategic omission that turned into a problem later. Cole's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something that was very briefly not the carefully held stillness she was used to. "There are things in my past that are classified," he said. "There are things that happened that I'm not going to talk about. Not because I'm hiding from them, but because they're not mine to put in the open." "Operations?" "Yes." "Nothing criminal?" "No." "Flat, certain." "Nothing criminal." She nodded. "Okay. You believe me?" "Yes," she said, simply. "I believe you." Cole looked across at the pavilion. "Then okay," he said. "Let them look. There's nothing there that changes what's happening here." The summit was the 21st and 22nd of February. Vivian spent the 2 weeks before it in the sustained, pressurized focus that major events required. The kind of working state she knew how to maintain, where the hours blurred and the personal margins got thin, and she ran on the particular fuel of necessity. Dara managed her schedule with military precision. Fiona and the legal team ran scenario planning. The board went through 3 preparatory calls. Diane's communications team prepared holding statements, media briefs, and 3 separate versions of the keynote opening, depending on how the Callaway situation developed. She saw Cole once during those 2 weeks, briefly, in the lobby of the building as she was arriving at 7 in the morning and he was finishing a night shift. They passed each other at the security desk. He didn't say anything, just gave her the same short nod he'd given her the very first night she'd seen him, and she had the strange sensation of the whole sequence of months collapsing into that moment. The first nod in the dark hallway, all the park afternoons, all the conversations, and now this one at 7 in the morning when they were both exhausted and in completely different kinds of hurry. "How's Lena?" he said. "She drew a picture of both of them," Vivian said. "Maya and her, at the pavilion table." Cole was quiet for a moment. "She show you?" "She left it on my pillow." He nodded, something moving briefly across his face that he didn't put into words. "Good luck with the summit," he said. She went into the building. She didn't look back, but she was aware, the way you're aware of certain things, that he stood there for a moment before he left. The first day of the summit went well by any external measure. Vivian's keynote was strong. She'd given it 3 times in the mirror and twice to Dara, and by the actual performance, she had the balance of warmth and authority calibrated well enough that the room responded. The panel discussions moved on schedule. The investor lunch generated the conversations that investor lunches were supposed to generate, and the evening reception had the particular, slightly forced energy of 400 professionals trying to relax strategically. Callaway was there. She saw him twice before they were formally introduced. Once across the reception room, where he was talking to 2 of her board members with the relaxed posture of someone who had already decided how the next several months would go, and once in the hallway near the presentation theater, where he caught her eye and raised his glass in a small, precise gesture that was not quite a toast and not quite a threat. He was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who had been powerful long enough that he'd stopped performing it. He came to their introduction with his hand already extended and a smile that didn't need much effort. "Vivian, I've admired your company for a long time." "I know," she said pleasantly. "That's why you've been buying it." His smile deepened slightly. He liked directness. She could see that immediately. "Smart company," he said. "Smart leader. I have no complaints about either. I do have some thoughts about long-term trajectory. I'm sure we'll have time to discuss that tomorrow." "I'm sure we will." He held her gaze for a moment that was 1 second longer than necessary. "Your daughter, she's doing well?" Vivian felt the air in the room change, the way air changes before something, though nothing visible had shifted. "My daughter is doing wonderfully," she said, in a tone that gave him nothing. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, and moved on. She stood there for a moment after he left, holding her glass of mineral water, her face arranged in the expression she'd learned to maintain in these situations. Fiona appeared at her shoulder within 30 seconds. "How was that?" "Careful," Vivian said. "He's very careful." "Tomorrow's sessions," Fiona said. "We're ready." "I know." What none of them were ready for, what could not have been staged or prepared or run in a scenario, was what happened at 7:43 the following morning. The second day of the summit began with a working breakfast session in the main event hall on the building's 3rd floor. Vivian was already at the venue by 6:30, running through logistics with the operations team, when Dara called her from the lobby downstairs. "There's a situation," Dara said. She found out in pieces. The way you found out about developing situations, fragments arriving out of order, each one reshaping the picture. The building's security system had flagged an anomaly in the overnight monitoring feed. A person had been in the building's lower parking structure during the night, in an area that wasn't covered by standard foot traffic. The system had caught it at 4:17 a.m., flagged it automatically, and generated a low-priority alert that hadn't been escalated because the overnight supervisor had assessed it as a possible equipment malfunction. It was not a malfunction. Marcus, her head of security, reached her at 7:15 with his face arranged in the particular way it arranged itself when he was managing something he didn't have complete information about. "Someone accessed the parking structure overnight," he said. "We have partial footage. It's not a theft situation. It looks like—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Like someone was looking for something, or placing something." "What do you mean, placing something?" "We found a device in the ventilation intake near the main event hall, small. Technical team is assessing it now." The word device could mean many things. In a corporate context, it could mean a listening device, a tracking device, a piece of hardware meant to intercept communications. It could also mean something worse, though in that moment, Vivian's operational brain was already running the contingency calculations, already thinking about what the summit's second day looked like with this new variable, already preparing the version of herself who could handle this. What her operational brain had not accounted for was that Lena was in the building. She'd arranged it carefully, or she'd thought she had. The second day of the summit included a children's hospitality area on the building's 2nd floor, a concession to the family-oriented messaging that her communications team had built into this year's program. Several board members had brought families. Vivian had brought Lena, under Dara's supervision, with the specific plan that Lena would be in the 2nd floor room with its soft lighting and its craft tables and its considerable distance from the main event activity. The plan had held until 7:20, when the 2nd floor hospitality room had a problem with its climate system, a malfunction that pushed the ambient temperature up by 8 degrees in 15 minutes and triggered a partial evacuation of that floor as a precaution while the building engineers responded. Dara had texted her twice. Vivian had been with Marcus. She had not seen the texts. By 7:40, when Vivian was standing with Marcus outside the main event hall processing what a device in a ventilation intake meant for the morning schedule, Lena was somewhere in the building and Dara was trying to find her. Vivian found out when Dara appeared in the hallway, slightly out of breath, and with the expression of someone managing a situation they wished very much to not be managing. "She's on this floor," Dara said. "She came up in the elevator. I was on the stairs and I missed her by—" "Where on this floor?" "The east corridor. She's fine. She's not distressed, but she found—" Vivian was already moving. The east corridor was the service access hallway that ran along the exterior of the main event hall. It was not supposed to have guests in it. It was where the catering staff moved between the kitchen and the hall, and where, at this specific moment, Marcus's security team had positioned two people near the ventilation access point while the technical assessment happened. Lena was sitting on the floor of the corridor, back against the wall, her sketchbook in her lap, drawing. Cole was crouching 6 feet in front of her. Vivian stopped. She took in the scene in the way she took in things that didn't immediately make sense, processing the pieces. Lena on the floor, calm, drawing. Cole crouching. And Cole's face, which was different from any version of it she had seen before. Still. Focused. Watching the corridor beyond where Lena sat with an attention that was not the park bench, not the hallway folding paper. This was something else. This was the precision she'd read about in a security file and tried to translate into the person she'd been talking to for months, and the translation had always come up slightly short. Now, it didn't. "What are you doing here?" she said. To Cole. It came out with more edge than she meant. "Working," he said, without turning from the corridor. "I was on the early maintenance rotation for the summit setup. I came through here about 20 minutes ago, and the room evac happened, and she was in the hallway." He paused. "I stayed with her." "Why are you looking at the corridor like that?" He stood up. I was taller than she usually thought of him as being, or maybe it was the posture. Something had shifted in the way he was holding himself. "How long has your security team known about the device in the ventilation system?" he said. Vivian went still. "How do you know about that?" "Because I noticed it at 5 this morning," he said, "and I reported it to the overnight supervisor, and he told me it was probably a sensor malfunction, and I told him it wasn't." He looked at her directly. "Did he escalate it?" 2 hours later, she said. Something moved across Cole's face. Not anger, closer to the controlled resignation of someone who had spent time in environments where a 2-hour delay had consequences. "Okay," he said. "Where's your security lead?" 30 feet down the hall." "Has anyone established whether the device is the only one, or whether there's something else in this building?" Vivian looked at him. In the space of approximately 90 seconds, she had recalibrated everything she thought she understood about the balance of this conversation. "Are you asking because you know something?" "I'm asking because that's the right question, and someone should be asking it." He glanced at Lena. "She's fine. She's been fine the whole time. But you should move the event and sweep the building before anyone else is in the main hall." Marcus had appeared behind Vivian in the corridor. He'd heard enough. He looked at Cole with the evaluating expression he used on information sources. He wasn't sure how to rate. "You reported it at 5. To your overnight supervisor. He wasn't interested." Marcus's jaw moved. "Can you walk me through what you saw?" "Yes." Cole looked at Vivian. "Go get Lena." She went. She sat down on the floor beside her daughter. The expensive suit on the service corridor floor, a fact that felt completely irrelevant, and looked at what Lena was drawing. It was the corridor. The perspective from where she was sitting, looking out toward the far end of the hall. It was precise. The proportions were accurate. And in the drawing, standing in the middle of the corridor like a landmark, was Cole. "Are you okay?" Vivian said. Lena didn't look up, but she moved her knee approximately 2 inches, and it pressed, very lightly, against Vivian's leg. She stayed there. Vivian sat on the floor of the service corridor and let that be what it was. The summit's second day started 90 minutes late. Marcus swept the building with a contracted security team and found no additional devices. The ventilation intake unit was removed and bagged. Local authorities were notified, which generated a whole separate sequence of conversations that Vivian handled with Fiona while simultaneously managing the board's anxiety and the communications team's containment efforts. Calloway attended the rescheduled morning session and said nothing publicly about the delay. In private, Vivian had 20 minutes with him in a side room, just the two of them and their respective counsel, and he made his position clear without making it threatening, which was the particular skill of someone who understood that threats were less effective than implications. "You've had a difficult morning," he said. "These things happen at large events." "They do," she agreed. "The company's security infrastructure might benefit from a review." "Our security team handled the situation efficiently. With some support, I understand." She looked at him. "The morning is behind us. The afternoon agenda is substantive. I'd like to focus on that." "Of course." He leaned back slightly. "Your company is impressive, Vivian. The things you've built here, genuinely impressive. I have no interest in disrupting any of that. I simply have some ideas about..." Optimization. Send them to Fiona in writing, she said. We'll review them. She left the meeting and went directly to the second-floor hospitality room, where Lena was sitting at one of the craft tables with Maya, who was apparently now attending a corporate summit because Cole had nowhere else to take her, and who had taken it upon herself to organize the craft table supplies by color and size in a system of her own design. I reorganized everything, Maya announced when Vivian came in. It was chaos before. It does look much better, Vivian said. Lena helped. She did the blues and greens. I did the reds and yellows. We split the purples. Vivian looked at her daughter. Lena was at the table with a glue stick and a piece of cardstock, building something, and did not look up. But she also did not do the thing where her shoulders came up toward her ears. She was relaxed. She was in the room and relaxed. Vivian sat down at the table. She didn't go back to the summit for 40 minutes. She found Cole in the east corridor again at the end of the day, when the building was emptying out and the catering crew was clearing the main hall and the long institutional energy of the event was finally unwinding. He was back in his gray uniform with his cart, working the corridor, doing the job he was actually scheduled to do. She stood in the corridor and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. She was thinking about the morning, about the version of him that had stood in this hallway and looked at the far end of the corridor with that particular focused attention, and about the version of him that sat under a tree in the park, watching his daughter climb a rope structure, and about how completely those two things lived in the same person. He turned. He didn't look surprised to see her. He rarely looked surprised at anything. "The device," she said. "Your assessment. When you saw it this morning, what did you think it was?" "Listening hardware," he said. "Compact. The kind that's not standard commercial equipment. Someone put it there who knew what they were doing." "Do you think it's Callaway?" Cole considered this. "I think it's someone who wanted to know what you were saying before you said it in the room. Whether that's Callaway directly or someone adjacent to him, that's your security team's problem to unpack." "You could have left," she said, "when the evac happened. You could have left Lena with whoever found her first and gone on with your shift." "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the floor and did the thing he did when he was choosing words with care. "After Melinda left, Maya's mother, I had about 8 months where I was not doing well. I was not managing things well. I wasn't present for Maya the way I should have been, because I was too far inside my own situation to see what was in front of me." He paused. "A woman in our apartment building used to look out for Maya sometimes during that period. She didn't make a big thing of it. She was just available. She'd see Maya in the hallway and bring her in for dinner, or she'd knock on our door if she hadn't seen us in a couple days. She never explained it or made it into something I had to accept formally." He stopped. "I've never really paid that back. I don't know how to pay something like that back except to do it when it's there to be done." Vivian stood in the corridor with the noise of the clearing event hall behind her and the city coming through the exterior window in the low blue of February dusk. She was aware that she was very tired and that the day had been very long, and that she was also, somewhere underneath all of that, intensely grateful for something that she didn't have clean language for. "Cole?" she said. "Yeah. Thank you." He nodded, just the nod. And then he went back to work, moving the cart down the corridor with the particular economy of motion of someone who didn't need acknowledgement to know what things were worth. She stood there for another moment and then went to get her daughter. Lena was in the hospitality room, alone now, the tables cleared, the supplies reorganized by Maya's color system. She was at the table with her sketchbook, and when Vivian came in, she looked up. She held out the sketchbook. Vivian took it carefully. She looked at the drawing on the open page. It was the corridor again. The same corridor perspective Lena had been drawing that morning. But this version was different. This one had 2 figures in it. Cole in the middle of the corridor, the way the morning drawing had shown him. And beside him, so close their outlines were almost touching, a smaller figure. The smaller figure was Vivian. She sat down at the craft table and looked at the drawing for a long time. Outside the windows, the city was going dark in stages, the way it always did, building by building, beside her, and didn't say anything and didn't need to. And the drawing lay between them on the table like something that had been true for a while and only needed time to be seen. The drawing stayed on Vivian's kitchen table for 11 days. She hadn't framed it or put it away. She'd set it there on the evening she brought it home from the summit, And every morning after that, she'd sat across from it with her coffee, and every morning she'd thought about moving it to somewhere more appropriate. Her desk, a folder, the corkboard in Lena's room. And every morning she hadn't. There was something about its position on the table, in the ordinary light of breakfast, that felt necessary. A correction to something. She wasn't sure what. Lena never mentioned the drawing. She rarely mentioned the things she made. They came out of her and existed, and that was the end of her relationship with them, as far as Vivian could tell. The making was the point. What happened after was someone else's business. The summit fallout occupied Vivian's professional life for the 3 weeks following. Marcus's team worked with a cybersecurity firm and the authorities to trace the device's origin, a process that generated significant paperwork and very few conclusive answers, at least not answers anyone was able to speak about on the record. Callaway's people issued a formal statement denying any connection to the incident. Fiona drafted responses. The board held 2 emergency calls. Diane's team managed the media coverage, which was ultimately smaller than it might have been because Vivian had asked Diane to make it smaller. And Diane was very good at that particular kind of management. What Callaway's people couldn't manage was the shareholder response to the incident itself. The attempted intelligence operation, because that was what it had been, whatever its origin, had the paradoxical effect of generating sympathy for Sterling Tech's leadership at precisely the moment Callaway needed the narrative to run the other way. 3 institutional investors who had been ambivalent broke toward Vivian's camp. By mid-March, Callaway had quietly backed off the board seat demand and filed the mandatory disclosure indicating he'd reduced his position to 8.3%. Fiona called to tell her on a Thursday afternoon, and Vivian said, "Good," and meant it without any particular triumph. The battle had been won largely by luck and timing, which was less satisfying than winning by brilliance, but was still winning. What stayed with her after the summit, what didn't file neatly into a resolved column, was the conversation in the corridor. The version of Cole that had stood in that hallway and assessed the situation with a precision that came from somewhere deep in his history, somewhere she'd read about in a security file but hadn't actually seen until then. She'd been thinking about it more than she wanted to admit, not with fear or worry, not in any way that made her question him, but with the particular intensity of someone trying to understand the full shape of a person they'd been seeing in partial light. She asked him about it directly because she'd learned that was the only way that worked. They were in the park. March now, the cold finally beginning to give a little, the kind of afternoon where you could feel the season thinking about changing. Lena and Maya were both at the pavilion table. This had become their place, the way certain spots become certain people's places without anyone deciding. And Vivian and Cole were on the bench that had become, similarly, their bench without discussion. "Tell me about what happened to you," she said. "Not the classified parts, the parts you can tell." Cole looked at the pavilion. "That's a wide question." "I know. You can answer whatever part of it you want." He was quiet for a while, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, which would have been its own kind of answer. Then he said, "My last deployment was in a part of the world where the rules about what you were doing and why changed faster than the situation on the ground. We were there for one reason officially. In practice, we were doing something else. I knew that. My whole team knew it. We executed, because that's what you do." He paused. And then the operation changed shape in a way that 2 men died because of a decision that was made above our level that didn't account for what was actually happening where we were. And I wrote a report that said so. Very specifically, with names. And I was medically discharged 8 weeks later with documentation about stress-related symptoms that I didn't have. He said it without bitterness, just the fact. The symptoms appeared in my file after I filed the report. I didn't fight it. I had Maya to think about, and fighting it would have taken years, and I wasn't in the condition to fight anything at that point anyway. Vivian sat with this. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it less." He glanced at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "The men who died." "One of them had 3 kids." Cole looked at his hands for a moment. "I still know their wives' names. I don't know what to do with that information except keep knowing it." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say, and she'd learned from him, among other things, that not every silence needed to be filled. "The bad stretch after," she said eventually, "that you mentioned. When Maya was small." "Yeah." "How bad?" He exhaled slowly. Bad enough that my neighbor kept my daughter fed 2 nights a week because she wasn't sure what was happening inside our apartment. He stopped. I wasn't violent. I want to say that clearly. I was never a danger to Maya. But I was gone. Even when I was physically there, I was somewhere else. It took me a long time to come back to the room I was actually in. What brought you back? He was quiet. Then, Maya started having nightmares. She was 4. She'd come into my room at 2 in the morning and stand next to the bed and not say anything. And I'd hear her breathing in the dark. And something about that, the sound of her just standing there waiting for me to notice her, something about that cut through whatever I was in. He paused. I got help. Eventually. Not immediately, but eventually. You went to therapy. I went to a guy my former CO recommended who had worked with combat veterans for 30 years and who did not let me run any of my standard strategies for not engaging with things. A brief dry edge in his voice. It was unpleasant. It helped. Vivian looked across at the pavilion. Maya was explaining something to Lena with considerable arm movement. Lena was watching her with the focused, tilted attention she gave things she found genuinely interesting. I've never talked to anyone, Vivian said, professionally, about any of it. Cole looked at her. About Lena. About what it's been like. She paused. I have people who ask me how I'm doing, and I have conversations with Lena's medical team, and I have Dara, who manages my life and notices everything and is discreet about most of it. But I've never sat across from someone whose job is to listen and talked about what this actually costs. She stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because we're being honest today, he said. Are we? Seems like it. She looked at her hands. I feel like I should be able to handle it without needing... I've built a company. I run 400 people. I don't understand why the thing that undoes me is sitting in a specialist's waiting room watching other parents flip through magazines. Because you can train for the hard things, Cole said. The unexpected loss, the thing that hits you from outside. You brace, you absorb, you adapt. But there's no training for loving something this much and being helpless anyway. That's the thing that gets everyone, no matter how capable they are. Vivian looked at him. She's not a problem you can solve, he said. Not unkindly, just directly. And you know that. But there's still a part of you that keeps trying to find the solution, because that's the version of yourself you trust. The one who finds solutions. He paused. The rest is the hardest part. Accepting that she doesn't need fixing, Vivian said quietly. Accepting that she's fine as she is. That the work is on the environment, not on her. He glanced at the pavilion. She's a complete person. She's been one the whole time. Vivian had heard versions of this from Dr. Patricia Huang. She'd read it in books. She'd had it said to her by specialists with degrees from institutions she respected. And she believed it. She did believe it, had believed it for a long time, on the intellectual level. But there was a difference between understanding something and no longer carrying the weight of its opposite. And she was only now, sitting on a park bench in March, beginning to understand where that difference actually lived. She fired the occupational therapist in April, not cruelly, not impulsively. She'd been thinking about it since February, and she talked it through with Patricia first, who agreed that the fit had run its course, and she gave appropriate notice and wrote a professional termination letter that Dara formatted and sent. But the internal decision had the feeling of something being set down that she'd been carrying for a long time without questioning whether she needed to carry it. The speech pathologist stayed. Lena had actually begun working productively with her in a way that she hadn't with anyone 6 months earlier, and Patricia thought it was worth continuing. But the behavioral specialist and the weekend social skills group that Lena had always arrived at already braced against. And the additional reading support program that was technically beneficial and that Lena found exhausting. Those she stepped back from, one at a time, over the course of 6 weeks. What she replaced them with was less. More space. More mornings at the kitchen table where no one was required to do anything with a timer. More afternoons at the park that weren't structured as therapeutic intervention, but were simply afternoons at the park. Lena's drawings got longer during this period. Not bigger, she still worked in the same sketchbooks, same page size, but more detailed, more layered, more willing to take up time. She filled entire books in weeks and started new ones. Maya's family started appearing regularly. The 2 braided hair figure with its perpetual forward momentum, the tall, broad-shouldered figure that was Cole, rendered in charcoal with a particular quality of attention that Vivian thought, privately, said something true about who her daughter had decided to see. Patricia looked at the drawings at Lena's April appointment and said, "She's expanding her social mapping. The internal representation of her world is getting more populated. That's significant." "She laughed last week," Vivian said. Patricia looked up from the sketchbook. "Maya said something, I couldn't even tell you what, and Lena laughed. It wasn't the polite laugh. It wasn't performative. It was the real thing. She was surprised by it." Vivian paused. "It surprised me too." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Keep doing what you're doing," she said. "Whatever this is, keep doing it." The thing between Vivian and Cole moved slowly, which suited them both for different reasons. There was an evening in April when Vivian brought dinner to the park. Actual dinner, from the Thai place near her building, packed in containers in a bag. Because they'd all been there longer than intended, and it was getting towards 6 and nobody had eaten. Cole had looked at the bag with an expression that was somewhere between amused and reluctant, and she'd said, "It's dinner, not a declaration." And he'd said, "Okay." And they'd eaten at the pavilion table while the girls drew and the city went orange in the west. It was one of the better evenings Vivian could remember. The simplicity of it was almost embarrassing. Takeout containers on a park table, the sound of Maya narrating her drawing to no one, Lena occasionally passing Cole her pencil to borrow, and always getting it back, the particular quality of early spring dusk that felt like something being returned. She noticed Cole noticing it too. The way he'd lean back sometimes and just look at the table, all of them around it, with an expression she now recognized. It was the same one he wore watching Maya on the rope structure. Not pride, not happiness exactly. Something more layered, the specific relief of someone who thought at some point they might not have any of this, and now has to keep adjusting to the fact that they do. What they didn't do, through April and into May, was talk directly about what was happening between them. This was not avoidance, not entirely. It was more like a mutual understanding that naming something prematurely could apply pressure to it that it didn't need. They'd both come from situations where things that were forced didn't hold. There was a shared patience to them that was probably visible to other people before it was fully visible to themselves. It was Dara who said something first, which was typical of Dara. "You're different," Dara said, on a Tuesday morning in early May, handing Vivian a schedule printout and a coffee in the same motion. "I'm not asking about it, I'm just noting it. Different how?" "You've laughed twice before 9 a.m., Dara said. "That's new." Vivian didn't say anything. "Also, you left at 6 yesterday. You've left before 7 4 times in the past 3 weeks. Dara's expression was neutral in the way it was neutral when she was carefully neutral. "Lena seems good." "She is good." "Good." A pause. "He seems like a serious person." "He is." "Good," Dara said again, and left the office with the efficiency of someone who had said exactly what they intended to say, and no more. The harder conversation happened in May, at her apartment. Cole had come to pick up Maya. The girls had spent the afternoon together, an arrangement that had developed organically and that Vivian's household staff had adapted to without drama. He came up to the apartment, which he'd done twice before, and she offered him coffee, which she'd done once before. And they sat at the kitchen table while Maya described, at length and with considerable dramatic reconstruction, everything she and Lena had done that afternoon. When Maya ran out of material and went to find Lena in her room, the apartment got quiet in the way it got quiet when the thing they'd been not quite saying had more space to be heard. Cole looked at his coffee cup. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Okay." "I don't know how to be in whatever this is," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I know how to be Lena's, whatever I am to Lena. I know how to be in the park on Saturdays. I don't know what I am here, at this table, in this apartment, and that's not a comfortable thing for me to not know." Vivian looked at him. "What does uncomfortable feel like for you?" "Like standing in a doorway," he said. "Not in, not out. Aware that I could go either way and not knowing which is the right direction." She thought about that. "That's where I've been for months," she said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something." "You think you don't belong here," she said, not accusingly, just saying what she heard underneath it. He looked at her directly. "I think I'm aware of the distance between your life and mine. I'm not ashamed of my life. I've made the choices I've made, and most of them I'd make again. But I'm aware that sitting here, in this kitchen, with— He gestured slightly at the apartment, which was large and well-appointed and overlooked the kind of view that appeared in architecture features. It would be easy to pretend the distance isn't there. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, she said. I know. And I'm not asking you to be in anything you don't want to be in. She paused. But I'll tell you what I actually think since we've been doing that today. Go ahead. I think the distance you're describing is real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. We come from different places, and we've built different things, and there are parts of my life that are genuinely difficult to be adjacent to. I know that. I've seen it cause problems for people who are in much better positions to handle it than you might think you are. She stopped. And I also think that you have spent a long time deciding who you're not, because of where you came from and what happened to you and the choices you made afterward. And some of that self-knowledge is accurate and good, and some of it might be a cage you've built to stay in because it feels safer than the alternative. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Something worked in his jaw. That's a direct thing to say to someone. You taught me that direct was better. I didn't mean— He stopped, started again. You might be right. I might be. I don't know how to do this, he said again. But differently this time. Less like a warning and more like an admission. I don't either, she said. I've never done this. Whatever this is, while running a company and raising a kid with complex needs and fighting off corporate raiders and eating Thai food in parks. She paused. But I've noticed that the things I've been most afraid of in the last year have been the things that turned out to matter most. So I've stopped using fear as a reliable indicator. Cole looked at the table, then at her. Something in his face settled, not resolved, but moved toward something. Maya thinks you're the smartest person she's ever met, he said. She told me last week you explained something about how bridges work, and she's been talking about it every day since. Vivian felt something warm move through her chest. She asked very good questions. She asks every adult she meets very good questions. You're the first one she's wanted to repeat. He paused. That means something to me. It means something to me too, she said. Cole left Apex Building Services in June. He didn't do it dramatically. He gave 4 weeks' notice, completed his remaining shifts, and left without ceremony, which was consistent with how he did most things. He'd been offered a position with a private security consulting firm, legitimate, well-regarded, run by a former special operations officer he'd served with, a man who'd been trying to recruit him for 2 years. The pay was substantially better. The hours were more predictable. It required occasional travel, which he and Vivian worked out between them in the unglamorous practical way of two people trying to coordinate 2 households and 2 children and 2 very different schedules. It was not a solution to the distance Cole had named at her kitchen table. It was just a different set of logistics around a thing that was still figuring out what shape it was going to take. Gareth Wiley said nothing when Vivian mentioned the change, which meant he had opinions but had been persuaded by his previous experience that expressing them was not worth the conversation. Marcus, who had done his own assessment of Cole in the summit aftermath, said only, "He's solid," which from Marcus was as close to an endorsement as he gave anyone. Dara sent Vivian a calendar invitation titled Saturday Park, recurring, without explanation and without asking permission, which was typical. The thing that happened in June that Vivian did not expect, that she could not have put in any calendar or prepared for in any of the ways she prepared for things, was the afternoon Lena spoke to Cole directly for the first time. It was a Saturday, late June, the first really warm Saturday of the year. They were at the park. Maya had graduated from the rope structure to the climbing wall on the far side of the equipment area, which was further away and required her to periodically disappear from view, a development that Cole tracked without commenting on because Maya was 8 and the climbing wall was 3 feet off the ground, and he was trying to let her have the experience of being independent even when every instinct he had ran in the opposite direction. Lena was beside him on the bench. She'd been sitting beside him rather than near him for the past month. The distance had closed incrementally until it was simply gone, until she occupied the bench the way any person occupied a bench next to someone they were comfortable with, without the careful negotiation of space that had defined everything before. She had her sketchbook open. She'd been drawing for 40 minutes. Cole was reading something on his phone. News, probably. He read the news with the habitual regularity of someone who'd spent time in places where information was survival. And then Lena said, without looking up from her drawing, "The wings are wrong." Cole looked at her. She turned the sketchbook toward him. She was drawing a bird, some kind of hawk or falcon, working from a reference photo she'd found in a book at school. The wings were extended in flight. "The angle," she said. She pointed with her pencil at the wing she'd been working on. "It should be more like this." She made a motion in the air with the pencil, adjusting an invisible angle. Cole looked at the drawing. He looked at it with the same attention he gave everything that deserved it. "You're right," he said. "The leading edge is too flat. On a diving bird, it comes down sharper." Lena looked at him. "Like this," he said, and held his hand out flat, then angled it, demonstrating. Not with the enthusiasm of someone excited to teach, just showing the thing, because the thing was what mattered. Lena watched his hand. Then she looked at the drawing. Then she put pencil to paper and adjusted the wing, and the line she drew was different and more accurate, and she knew it was more accurate because she stopped and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of a problem correctly resolved. Cole went back to his phone. Lena went back to her drawing. Vivian was sitting on the grass 15 feet away, her back against the tree, a water bottle in her hand, and she had heard all of it. She had heard every word, including the two that Lena had chosen, the two words that had moved through 400 days of silence like the first sound after a held breath. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and she was not going to cry in a public park in June. But she sat against the tree with her water bottle and felt something give way inside her chest. Not the clean, sharp feeling of a wound, but the slower, softer feeling of something long braced finally being allowed to release. Cole didn't look at her. He understood. She knew he understood, because he understood almost everything about the thing that was happening here. That looking at her in that moment would have made it into something other than what it was, which was just two people on a bench talking about a bird's wing in the ordinary afternoon. Maya appeared from the direction of the climbing wall at a dead run, shouting something about having reached the top, and Lena looked up at her sister, because that was what Maya was becoming, incrementally, in the way that these things happened. And the satisfaction was still on her face, the resolved problem satisfaction, and she held up the drawing, and Maya looked at it and said, "That's so good. The wings look real." And Lena turned back to her page and kept drawing. The afternoon went on. The city went on around them. Cole put down his phone and watched the climbing wall. Vivian sat against the tree and watched all of them. At some point, without making it a decision, she understood that this was what it looked like. Whatever this was. Whatever they were building between them out of Saturday afternoons and takeout containers and park benches and two girls who had found each other across a pavilion table. It didn't look like anything she'd imagined or planned or budgeted for. It looked like this. The ordinary, imperfect, deeply human thing that couldn't be engineered or purchased or scheduled. Lena said 11 more words before they went home that evening. Not to Vivian, not yet, not that day, but to Maya, answering a question about the drawing, and to Cole once more about something else entirely. 11 words in 3 hours, which was more than she'd offered anyone outside her family in the better part of a year. That night, Vivian sat on the edge of Lena's bed while her daughter got ready to sleep, and Lena picked up a small paper crane from her nightstand, the first one slightly imperfect, one wing longer than the other, and held it for a moment before setting it back down. "He made that," Vivian said. Lena looked at it. Then she looked at her mother with the direct, focused attention that she gave things she was trying to understand completely. "I know," she said, and that was all. She lay down and closed her eyes, and Vivian sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight and did not move for a long time because there was no place she needed to be more than exactly where she was. Summer moved through the city the way summers did, gradually and then all at once, until one morning you stepped outside and the air was a different thing than it had been the week before, heavier and warmer and carrying the particular smell of the season that had no name but that everyone recognized. Vivian noticed it on the morning of the second Saturday in July, standing at her kitchen window with her coffee going cold in her hand, watching the street below where the trees had gone fully green and the light was falling at the specific July angle that made everything look more itself than usual. She'd been awake since 5:30, which was not unusual, but she'd been standing at this window since 6, which was. She was thinking about a phone call she'd had the previous afternoon with a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, a developmental neuroscientist at a research university across the country who ran a program for families navigating autism with insufficient support structures. The call had been Vivian's third with Sandra in as many months. The first had been professional. Vivian had reached out through Patricia Huang's network, looking to understand the research landscape, the gaps, where private funding could make a meaningful difference versus where it would simply duplicate what already existed. The second call had gone longer and covered more ground. The third had ended with Sandra saying quietly, "I think you already know what you want to build. I think you've known for a while." Vivian had said she'd think about it. She'd been thinking about it since she hung up. The foundation idea had started as an abstract, something she'd mentioned to Cole in passing in May, the vague shape of a thing, the feeling that her position and her resources and the particular education she'd received over the past year created an obligation she hadn't yet figured out how to discharge. Cole had listened without much comment, which was how he engaged with things he was taking seriously. And then 2 weeks later he'd said, out of nowhere, sitting on the park bench in the particular way he had of returning to conversations that had apparently continued inside his own head, "What would it actually do? The foundation?" "I don't know yet," she'd said. "What do families need that they don't have?" She'd thought about all the waiting rooms, all the specialists she'd flown in and the programs she'd enrolled Lena in and the reports she'd read and the strategies she'd tried. And then she'd thought about Cole sitting on the floor of a hallway folding a paper crane for no audience. Time, she'd said. They need someone to buy them time, and they need to stop feeling like they're failing when the strategies don't work. Cole had nodded. Then that's what it does. It was not a business plan, but it was the center of one, and she'd been building outward from it ever since. She set her coffee down and went to get dressed. She had a call at 8 and a board meeting at 10, and approximately 40 things that needed to happen before Saturday afternoon, and she moved through all of them with the competence of someone who had been managing complex systems for a decade. And at 4:30, she picked up Lena from the small summer art program she'd started attending. 6 kids, a patient instructor named Hero, a studio that smelled like paint and wood and the good kind of productive mess, and drove home with her daughter drawing in the back seat and thought about Sandra Okafor's question. "I think you already know what you want to build." She did know. She'd known since February, if she was being honest with herself. The summit's chaos had clarified something, the way acute situations sometimes clarified things that ambient life kept soft and unresolved. She'd stood in a service corridor and watched Cole keep her daughter safe and steady in an environment that had gone sideways, and she'd thought, this is what matters. Not the investors, not the board, not Callaway and his 11%. This. The person on the floor of the hallway who understood what her daughter needed before anyone asked him to. The problem was not knowing how to build something worthy of that understanding. She told Cole about Sandra and the foundation properly. In late July, at her apartment after dinner, the girls in Lena's room doing whatever they were doing that involved occasional bursts of Maya's voice and the periodic sound of something being organized and reorganized on a hard surface. She walked him through it. Not the vague shape this time, but the actual structure she'd been developing with Sandra over the past 2 months. A foundation with 2 components, a direct support program that would fund access to quality therapeutic care for families who couldn't afford it, and a research partnership with Sandra's university that would focus specifically on what actually worked for children across the spectrum, rather than what looked good in small sample studies. "There's a third part," she said, "that I'm less certain about." Cole waited. "I want to build a training program for people who work with these families. Not the specialists. The specialists have their own training pipelines. But the people adjacent to these kids. Teachers, childcare workers, people who run after-school programs." She paused. "People who interact with these kids every day and have no framework for understanding how to do that without running the agenda, without the pressure." She looked at him. "I want to teach what you do instinctively, and I don't know how to do that without you." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not a therapist," he said. "I know. I don't have credentials. I don't have anything that would look legitimate to the people who—" "Cole," she stopped him. "I'm not asking you to be a therapist. I'm asking you to help me develop a curriculum. What you do, the patience, the indifference to outcome, the ability to be in the room without making someone feel like a project. that can be taught. Not perfectly, not to everyone, but enough. Sandra thinks so too. I've described it to her in general terms, and she thinks it's one of the more practical approaches she's heard. He looked at his hands, the habit he had when he was taking something apart internally. You can say no, she said. I will build it without that component if you say no. I'll find another way. That's not, he stopped, started again. That's not what I'm working through. What are you working through? The idea that something I figured out by accident because my life went sideways is worth building a program around. He looked up. I didn't sit on that floor because I had a philosophy. I sat on the floor because it seemed like the thing to do. I don't know how to teach something I've never understood as a system. I know, she said. That's why Sandra would be involved. She understands the system. She can build the framework. What she doesn't have is the lived experience of what it looks like when it actually works. She paused. You're not being asked to be the expert. You're being asked to be the proof. Something moved across his face. She'd learned to read those movements, not perfectly, but well enough. This one was the one she associated with him encountering something he hadn't let himself want and then finding it in front of him without warning. I'm going to think about it, he said. That's fine. I will probably say yes, he said. I know, she said, and didn't push it further because she'd learned from him when to stop. He said yes 3 days later in a text message at 7 in the morning that read, Talk to Sandra. She's direct. I like that. Let's build it. Vivian read it standing in her kitchen and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully recognized as held until it let go. She put the phone face down on the counter and went to make Lena's breakfast. And when Lena came out of her room with her hair not yet brushed and her sketchbook already under her arm, because she carried it everywhere, the way other people carried phones, Vivian looked at her daughter in the morning light and thought, this is how things change. Not in declarations, not in dramatic reversals. In a text at 7 a.m., in a drawing of a bird's wing corrected on a park bench, in a child sitting in a doorway because a man on the other side of it made paper animals without making it mean anything. This is how it actually happens. The Foundation's public announcement was scheduled for October. Vivian had wanted to do it quietly, a press release, maybe a small event for Sandra's university partners, and a handful of family advocates. But Diane had made the case, methodically and with supporting data, that a public launch would generate the kind of media attention that translated directly into donor interest, which translated directly into the Foundation's ability to do what it was supposed to do. Vivian had listened to the argument, disagreed with the instinct behind it, and agreed with the conclusion, which was the particular discipline of being someone who ran a large organization. The event was at Sterling Tech headquarters. 3rd floor. Not the main event hall where the summit had happened, but the east-facing conference space that looked out over the city and had the soft lighting that Lena could tolerate. It held 120 people. They invited family advocates, researchers, donors, 3 journalists Diane trusted, a dozen families who had engaged with Sandra's program, and a small number of people from Vivian's professional life who had earned the right to be in the room. Gareth and Fiona came. Dara was there managing logistics with the focused efficiency of someone who ran on competence and dark humor. Dr. Patricia Huang was in the 3rd row. Marcus stood near the back in the way Marcus always stood near things, aware of every exit, assessing nothing he could be accused of assessing. Cole sat in the 2nd row with Maya, who was wearing a dress she had selected herself and which involved a pattern that she described as controlled chaos, which was accurate. Lena was beside Vivian on the small, raised platform at the front of the room, sitting in the chair they'd placed there for her, with her sketchbook in her lap because they'd learned long ago to let her have it in public spaces. She wasn't drawing, she was looking at the room. Vivian stood at the podium and looked out at the gathered faces and felt the specific weight of a room that was waiting. Not the corporate weight of boardrooms and investor calls, which she knew how to carry, but something different. Something that required a different part of her. She talked about Sterling Tech briefly, because context required it. She talked about Sandra and the Research Foundation, and the 2 components of the direct support program, and what the partnership with the university was designed to accomplish. She spoke for 9 minutes in the measured, prepared way she'd been trained to speak, and the room was attentive and responsive in everything Diane had said it would be. And then she stopped. She looked at her notes, and she set them down. I want to tell you why this matters to me personally, she said. Not the corporate version, the actual version. The room adjusted. The particular adjustment of an audience that has been expecting a particular kind of presentation and is suddenly in a different one. She talked about the waiting rooms, the specialists, the strategies that failed not because they were wrong, but because they were aimed at the wrong target. She talked about what it felt like to have every resource available and still stand on the other side of a glass wall watching approach after approach fall short. She was not performing emotion. She was simply telling the truth, which is its own kind of performance, but a more honest one, and the room heard the difference. The person who changed my understanding of my daughter, she said, is not a therapist. He is not a researcher. He has no credentials in this field. He's a former military serviceman who worked a maintenance job and spent Saturday afternoons in the park watching his own daughter play. And he sat on the floor of a hallway one evening and folded paper animals while my daughter watched from a doorway, and she walked through that door on her own terms. She paused. He didn't cure anything. He didn't fix anything. He understood something that I'd been told in different ways by different people and never fully absorbed until I saw it, that my daughter was not a problem waiting to be solved. She was a person waiting to be seen. The room was very quiet. I've learned things this year that I should have learned from books or from the professionals I paid very well, Vivian said. And I've also learned that understanding something in your head and actually living it are separated by a distance that requires more than information to cross. It requires a specific kind of patience that I think is teachable and that I think most of us are not taught because most of us are moving too fast to need it until we suddenly, desperately do. She stopped. That's what this foundation is also for. Teaching people to slow down enough to be in the room with someone who needs something different from them. Not better, different. She looked at Lena, who was still not drawing, still looking at the room with that focused, tilted attention she gave to things she was studying. My daughter is going to say something now, Vivian said. She asked me this morning if she could, and I told her she didn't have to, and she said she wanted to. A pause. That's also new. She stepped back from the podium. Lena looked at the room for a long moment. The room looked back. Vivian stood 2 feet behind her and watched her daughter sit with 120 people looking at her without flinching. Then Lena opened her sketchbook. She held it up, facing the room, so that the page was visible. It was a drawing of the park, the bench, the pavilion, the climbing wall in the distance with a small figure at the top of it. In the foreground, 2 figures on the bench, one tall, one small, and on the grass nearby, another small figure drawing in a book. She held it there for 10 seconds. Then she put it back in her lap. He sat on the floor, she said, into the microphone. Her voice was even, clear, the voice of someone who had chosen their words carefully and far in advance. So I didn't have to look up. 8 words. The room absorbed them in the way rooms absorb things that are too precise to process immediately, too simple to explain why they hit as hard as they did. Vivian heard someone in the second row exhale. She did not look because she was looking at her daughter, who had turned back to face forward and whose shoulders were completely level, not braced, not coiled, not managing anything, just there, just present in a room full of people, which was something Vivian had not known if she would ever see. She looked at Cole. He was looking at Lena. His face was doing the thing that wasn't quite any single identifiable emotion and that she'd come to understand was the truest version of what he felt, the layered thing that didn't simplify neatly, the version of a person that existed underneath the version they managed. He looked at Vivian. 1 beat. She looked back. And that was all that needed to happen in that moment, between those 2 people, in that room. After the event, after the reception, after the conversations, after Diane had her numbers, and Sandra had her contacts, and Dara had managed the logistics out of existence. After all of it, the 4 of them ended up back at the park. It was not planned. It was Maya who asked, standing in the lobby of the building in her chaos-patterned dress with her shoes in one hand, because she'd been wearing them for 4 hours and 4 hours was the limit. Can we go to the park? She said. I want to show Lena the new thing they put on the climbing wall. Lena looked at Cole. A direct look. Asking without asking. It was something she'd started doing in the past month. This quiet habit of checking in with him. The kind of nonverbal communication that existed between people who had established a language of their own. Up to your mom, Cole said, which was also new. Not the deference, but the naturalness of it, the absence of self-consciousness about what it implied. Vivian looked at her daughter's face, at the October evening outside the lobby glass, at Cole's jacket, which he'd put back on, and which had a small piece of tape on one lapel from something Maya had done to it earlier, and which he hadn't noticed. "Let's go to the park," she said. The park was quieter in the evening. The families with young children had mostly gone home. There was a man walking a dog and two teenagers on the far bench, and the particular autumn evening light that made the whole space feel more private than it was. Maya went directly to the climbing wall. Lena followed her, not because Maya asked her to, but because she wanted to, and the distinction was everything. Cole and Vivian walked behind them and did not talk for a while, the comfortable silence of people who had stopped needing to fill the air between them. They sat on the bench, their bench. "How are you?" Cole said. "Tired," she said honestly. "Good tired." He nodded, looked at the girls. Maya was demonstrating the new climbing configuration with considerable athletic enthusiasm and what Vivian estimated to be a 30% grasp of actual climbing technique. Lena was watching from the ground, tracking Maya's path up the structure with the focused attention she gave things she was memorizing. Then Lena put her hand on the first rung. Vivian went still. Cole went still. Lena looked up at the structure. She looked at Maya, who was at the top and who had not noticed, who was looking out at the park from her altitude and describing what she could see as if she were a satellite. Then Lena climbed, slowly, methodically. One rung, then another, then another. Her sketchbook left on the ground below because she needed both hands, and she'd made that calculation for herself. She got 2/3 of the way up and stopped. Looked down at the ground. Looked across at the horizon in the way Maya had been looking at it. "It's higher than it looks," she said. Not to anyone in particular, just a fact she'd confirmed. Maya looked down and saw her. Her face did the thing Maya's face did when she was genuinely delighted, which was to become entirely itself. "You made it up here," she said, as if Lena had simply chosen the moment, as if it were that simple. "Part of the way," Lena said. "Part of the way counts," Maya said, with the authority of someone who had decided this was a philosophical position. Lena considered the view for another moment. Then she climbed back down, step by careful step, retrieved her sketchbook from the ground, and went back to the bench. She sat beside Cole, opened to a new page, and began to draw the climbing wall from ground level, with two figures near the top. Cole and Vivian looked at each other across the back of Lena's head. "Part of the way counts," Vivian said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "It does." There's a particular kind of arrival that doesn't feel like an ending. It doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where you step across a threshold and the music swells and the light shifts and you understand that you've reached the place you were going. Life doesn't tend to work that way, and the people it works on least are the ones who've spent time in real darkness. The kind where you stop waiting for the music because you've learned the music isn't coming, and you start navigating by whatever light is actually available. Cole Bennett had been navigating by available light for a long time. He understood something that took most people years in the wrong direction to learn. That the absence of everything you planned for is not the same as the absence of everything that matters. That a man can lose a career and a marriage and a version of himself he'd built over 15 years and still stand in a park on an October evening and feel something that isn't what he would have called happiness in any of the previous chapters of his life, but that is quieter than that and more durable. And Vivian Sterling, who had spent a decade being profoundly capable in all the ways that professional life rewarded and quietly undone in all the ways it didn't measure, had learned something that no board meeting or strategic review or expert consultation had managed to teach her. That the most important things she would ever do would not look important from the outside. They would look like sitting on a bench. They would look like leaving work at 6. They would look like a child climbing 2/3 of the way up a structure and stopping, and that being exactly enough. Neither of them were finished. That's the part that doesn't make it into the clean versions of stories like this, the part where the people involved are still imperfect and still carrying things, and still, on certain mornings, reverting to the survival strategies of whoever they used to be before they knew better. Cole still woke up some nights from the kind of dream that didn't fully leave with the waking. Vivian still sat at her desk sometimes at 11 p.m. running scenarios for problems that could wait until morning, because the habit of anxiety was older than any new understanding she'd arrived at. Lena still had hard days, days when the world was too loud and too much, and the distance she needed was total. Maya still talked over everything and sometimes over everyone and was working on it, according to her teacher, with approximately 40% success. None of it was resolved in the way that movies resolved things, in the single clean moment of transformation. It was resolved the way life actually resolved things, slowly, in small adjustments, in the ongoing ordinary decision to keep showing up for each other on the days when showing up was easy and on the days when it wasn't. The foundation launched its first family support cohort in January, 12 families, 3 cities, a combination of clinical support and the training curriculum that Sandra and Cole had spent 4 months building together in the particular working style they'd developed. Sandra, with her research frameworks and her precise language, Cole with his flat refusal to make anything more complicated than it needed to be. The curriculum ran to 38 pages. Cole had wanted it shorter. Sandra had won on the length, but Cole had won on the tone, which was plain and direct and free of the professional softness that made people feel understood while they were reading it, and lost when they were actually in the room with a child who needed something from them. The pilot feedback came back in March. 14 of the 18 support workers who completed the program reported measurable changes in how they engaged with the children in their care. 3 families reported outcomes they hadn't expected to see for another year. One father wrote a letter to Sandra that she forwarded to Vivian without comment, a letter that was 4 paragraphs long and ended with, "I thought I was doing it wrong. Now I think I was just doing it fast." Vivian read it twice and sent it to Cole. He read it once and said nothing for a day and then said, "That's the one. That's the thing we're trying to fix." She agreed. That was the thing. By the following spring, they were in 2 more cities, and Sandra had submitted a research paper to a peer-reviewed journal with Cole listed as a contributing author, a designation he'd initially resisted and then accepted because Sandra had pointed out that resisting it was a form of disappearing from your own work, and he recognized the accuracy of the critique. At home. And it was home, in the way that 2 households that shared most of their evenings and all of their Saturdays and the logistics of 2 school schedules and 1 aging car that Cole refused to replace for reasons he didn't fully explain became home. Things settled into the shape they were going to have. Not a perfect shape. A shape that fit the actual people in it, which was better. Lena turned 9 in April. Her birthday party was 7 people: Vivian, Cole, Maya, Patricia Huang, who was now less doctor and more person who came to birthday parties. Dara, who brought a cake that was slightly lopsided because she'd made it herself as a point of pride and was not a skilled baker, and Hero from the art studio, who came with a set of charcoal pencils that Lena unwrapped and immediately opened and smelled, which was how she assessed art supplies, by smell, and found acceptable. It was not a large party. Lena had been specific about that, in the way she was increasingly specific about things she had opinions about, which was one of the changes of the past year that Vivian found most astonishing. Not that Lena had opinions, she'd always had opinions, but that she was finding the words to put around them, in her own time and her own sequence, without being pushed. She'd told Vivian in February, in the kitchen before school, that she didn't like the birthday parties where people sang loudly. Vivian had said, "Okay," and that had been the whole conversation. So they sang quietly. All 7 of them, quietly, slightly off-key, because Cole could not carry a tune, and Maya had her own interpretation of every melody she attempted, and Patricia turned out to be the only person in the room with any musical accuracy whatsoever. Lena sat at the table and watched them with the expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory, the expression that Vivian had learned to read as contentment, her daughter's version of it, which didn't look like anyone else's, but was entirely real. She blew out 9 candles on a lopsided cake. She made a wish. She did not tell anyone what it was. Cole, sitting across the table, caught Vivian's eye over the candle smoke. He raised his eyebrows slightly, the small gesture that meant he was asking without asking. She shook her head slightly. She didn't know what Lena had wished for, but she looked at the table, at the lopsided cake and the charcoal pencils, and Maya already negotiating for the first slice, and Patricia laughing at something Dara had said, and Lena sitting in the middle of all of it, present, not braced, not managing, just there. And she thought that whatever Lena had wished for, the bones of it were probably already in the room. Outside the window, the city did what it always did, indifferent and continuous. The afternoon light came through and touched the table and the faces around it and the small paper crane that sat on the corner of the windowsill, the original one, slightly imperfect, one wing longer than the other, that had been there since October and that no one had moved because it had become one of those objects that becomes part of the texture of a place, unremarkable and irreplaceable at the same time. Cole had made it on a hallway floor for no one, and it had ended up here. That was how most things worked, in Vivian's experience, if you stayed in the room long enough to find out. The things that mattered started as nothing. They started as a man sitting down on the floor because it seemed like the thing to do. They started as a child standing in a doorway, not asked to cross it, crossing it anyway. They started small and slow and without announcement, and then one day you looked up and they were everything.